I think maybe the most surprising thing about this novel is that it was written pre-COVID, because in many ways it's the ultimate pandemic book. I mean, it's all about isolation, withdrawal from society, disintegrating mental health, and going full-on goblin mode, as well as contextualizing all of those personal responses within the framework of late-stage capitalism, pervasive consumerism, wealth accumulation, class politics. It's a good reminder that none of those issues were created by the coronavirus. They were simply brought to the forefront of our collective consciousness for a while. And while they've receded to an extent, they're still there. We still need to talk about them. We still need to deal with them. Let's get started. Welcome to the Politics of Fiction. I'm Darren. I look at literature through a political lens, and today we're talking about My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. So let's do a quick review, as usual, before we get into the politics. So this was my second time reading this book. I read it a few years back for my book club, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I just had a look back at my book club spreadsheet. Yes, I keep a spreadsheet. I am a nerd. And I gave it a 3.6 out of 5, which is not bad. I probably got a bit more out of the novel on this second reading, and ended up enjoying it a little bit more, I think. It's not without its flaws, but I do think it's a really good read overall. So, what does it do well? I really like the whole tone and vibe of the book. It's provocative, caustic, sardonic. I think it does a good job of showing the fragility of the human condition, the effects of trauma and grief and how they can be displaced, the things people do in order to escape pain and suffering. It's an unflinching and realistic portrayal of one type of depression. There's also a lot of nice class commentary in there, some good stuff on wealth, status, consumerism, art, beauty. There's a good bit of humor, although it is quite dark. Some of the narrator's scathing criticisms of other people, as pathetic as it is also very funny. For example, here she is talking about a particular type of hipster man. Dudes reading Nietzsche on the subway, reading Proust, reading David Foster Wallace, jotting down their brilliant thoughts into a black moleskin pocket notebook, beer bellies and skinny legs, zip-up hoodies, navy blue peacoats or army green parkas, New Balance sneakers, knit hats, canvas tote bags, small hands, hairy knuckles, maybe a deer head tattooed across a flabby bicep. They rolled their own cigarettes, didn't brush their teeth enough, spent $100 a week on coffee. They would come into Ducat, the gallery I worked at, with their younger, usually Asian, girlfriends. There were a few other funny lines, normally when she's talking to her long-suffering friend, Riva. At one point she says, "People used to hibernate all the time." There's a long conversation over whether to condole someone is an appropriate way to say, give someone your condolences. And there's an amazing word choice of voguing, as Riva is telling her about the box that her mother's remains are in. The novel contains a lot of dark human thoughts that normally go unvoiced. I like something that dares to be a bit subversive, and the subject matter here, the themes, the depiction of the protagonist especially, are all quite transgressive, which means even if you don't love the book, it makes for a pretty interesting read. When certain ideas and norms around society, femininity, mental health, whatever, are being challenged. And I think this is probably the novel's best quality. So what are its faults? What does Moshfegh not do quite so well? I think it runs out of juice a bit after a strong opening third. The middle sags a little bit, there's still some good stuff in there, then it kind of limps towards its ending. It's not even the pacing as such, I just think all the good stuff is kind of front-loaded to an extent. Another thing is that it's a book that leaves you very cold. I mean, it's deliberately cynical, which I like about it, and that kind of faux pathos at the end, as the protagonist emerges from her supposedly transformative experience, only heightens that. Incidentally, from reading reviews, I gather a lot of people seem to have misinterpreted, in my opinion, that ending as genuine. For me, it couldn't be clearer that this is very much an American Psycho style ending. There is no catharsis. This confession has meant nothing. There are, in fact, a lot of parallels between this book and American Psycho. But anyway, I like the cynicism, and it works for the most most part, but by the end it just leaves you feeling a bit drained. There's just a bit too much irredeemable cruelty, vapidity, and antipathy to wade through. The tone is just unremittingly bleak, which is a bit wearing by the time you come out the other side of it. The writing is nothing special. It's not bad. The prose is simple and perfunctory. There are some nice wry, mordant lines here and there, but very little figurative language, which makes sense, I guess, given the narrator's character and her condition. Maybe Moshfegh could have made her a bit more pretentious to fit in a bit more decent literary prose. It doesn't have to be like The Secret History or Lolita or anything, but a bit more lyricism and imagery, even a bit more detail, would have improved the reading experience. But that's just my preference. That's obviously not what she was going for here, which is fair enough. I think maybe the biggest weakness of the book, and it is something I saw mentioned in a lot of reviews, is that it kind of carries itself as more profound than it actually is, and that it's actually quite a superficial treatment of its subject matter. Now, I do think that the novel touches on a lot of really pertinent social, personal, political points, which we'll get into later, but is it a bit shallow in terms of how much it actually digs into some of those? Yeah, it is. It's not that there's no substance to it, but there's probably a bit less than you would like for a book dealing with these kind of themes. So as a result, I find myself liking the concept and the vibe a bit more than the execution. But I still think, all in all, it's a pretty good book. It entertained me, it was thought-provoking, I'm glad I read it. So we've already kind of covered there the subject matter, the tone, the writing. The plot is pretty thin. Depressed woman self-medicates in order to withdraw from the world. That's about it. We'll talk more about that a bit later when we get into mental health. Let's just cover one more area before we move on to the politics and talk about the characters. So obviously the main character here is our unnamed narrator. I thought she was really well drawn. The fact that so many people find her abhorrent and frustrating to read, I think, is testament to this. I think sometimes there's a bit of unwarranted criticism with books like these where it's kind of like, okay, the main character is bad, therefore the book is bad. Now, I do accept the point that it can be tedious to read a book from the point of view of an awful human being, if there's nothing compelling about them or the story or whatever. But I don't think that's the case here. Now, she is certainly an awful human being. There's definitely a touch of the Patrick Bateman sociopathy about her. She's detached, cruel, malignant. So much of what she says is acerbic and self-pitying. She's both terribly vain and massively insecure. But she's also very interesting, I think. I was compelled to wonder, how did she turn out this way? And I did find it entertaining to read her thoughts and to go with her through this experience. So the narrator is generally misanthropic. She's horrible to pretty much everyone. But obviously the main way that we learn about how much of a shitbag she is through her incredibly toxic friendship, if you can call it that, with Riva. The list of awful things she says about Riva, or to her in many cases, is too long to read out. It would take an hour. But here are just a few examples. I loved Riva, but I didn't like her anymore. We'd been friends since college, long enough that all we had left in common was our history together, a complex circuit of resentment, memory, jealousy, denial, and a few dresses I'd let her borrow, which she'd promised to dry clean in return, but never did. I took a Polaroid of her one night and stuck it into the frame of the mirror in the living room. Riva thought it was a loving gesture, but the photo was really meant as a reminder of how little I enjoyed her company if I felt like calling her later while I was under the influence. The next day, Riva came over to whine about her dying mother. She was going to be annoying, I could tell. She'd expect me to say comforting things, to put an arm around her shoulders while she sobbed at the funeral. I was trapped. The day would be hell. I would suffer. This is when Riva is giving her mother's eulogy at the funeral. Everything she said sounded like she'd read it in a Hallmark card. Halfway through, she stopped and looked down at me as though for approval. I gave her a thumbs up. But did I care? I didn't think so. If Riva's body was hanging by the neck behind the bath curtain, I might have just gone home. Poor Riva. While we're on the subject, I think Riva is a well-drawn character too. Manically insecure, desperately superficial, but in a mostly harmless way. Shallow, but overly earnest. Very much a victim in many different ways of our society and its expectations. So anyway, back to the narrator. She really doesn't fit into society in any way at all. Professionally, emotionally, psychologically, whatever. And I found that compelling. At the end of the day, she is a human being who has been shaped by her environment. Is she also not worthy of some degree of sympathy like any other person? There's that Jungian idea that we're all capable of terrible evil in the right circumstances. Well, if you're born into a certain family and you have certain experiences and you have certain brain chemistry, I mean, we're probably all capable of being mean and vicious and envious and bitter and so on. I really like that the book explores this moral and psychological murkiness without shying away from it or copping out with a more likable character or a redemption arc tacked on at the end. Looking through the eyes of someone who's been poisoned by trauma, grief, shitty parents, consumerism, societal pressure, and everything else allows us to see very clearly what it does to people, the effect it has on the fragile human condition. So unpleasant as she is, I did empathize with her a little bit. Whether it was during COVID or any other difficult periods that we've gone through, I'm sure we've all had times when you just want your comfort movies, you just want to be alone, you just want to isolate. So yeah, she is a fairly vile person, but there's also this kind of universal humanist element to her. Is there any character development? Has she changed or grown by the end? No, but that's kind of the point. She thinks that she's emerged from her chrysalis some newly reforged being, pure and luminous and one with the world. But she hasn't. She's still an unpleasant, vacuous arsehole. She's just now also deluded. And I really like that as an ending. I think it's entirely appropriate. There are a few other peripheral characters in the book. There's Dr. Tuttle, the eccentric and professionally dubious psychiatrist who enables our main character's pharmacologically induced torpor. She's quite a funny character. She's got a few good lines. Then there's Trevor, the ex. I think Moshfegh really nailed this one. He's a perfect portrait of a particular type of guy whose whole thing is treating women like shit. He worked as a portfolio manager in the Twin Towers, had freckles, loved Bruce Springsteen, and yet the wall above his bed was decorated with horrifying African masks. He collected antique swords. He liked cocaine and cheap beer and top-shelf whiskey. Always owned the latest video game system. He had a waterbed. He played acoustic guitar badly. He owned a gun he kept in a safe in his bedroom closet. Then you have the art gallery scene, the curator, a few of the artists, one in particular who we get to know. There's some nice satirical humour there, although that whole modern art scene is a bit over-parodied, I would say, in contemporary culture. So it does feel a little bit stale, but there are some funny details. So let's get into the political and social issues that the book deals with. We'll start with mental health and the human condition. So at the start of the book, we find the narrator hibernating, as she calls it. I watched movies and ate animal crackers and took trazodone and Ambien and Nembutal until I fell asleep again. I lost track of time. Days passed, weeks, a few months went by. I took a shower once a week at most. I stopped tweezing, stopped bleaching, stopped waxing, stopped brushing my hair. No moisturizing or exfoliating, no shaving. I left the apartment infrequently. So she's clearly depressed, and her way of dealing with it is withdrawing from the world completely. She ignores the news and watches only comfort movies. She avoids human contact as much as possible. She self-medicates so she can sleep most of the day, every day. So let's examine a few aspects of her life before we talk more about how she handles her depression. Let's talk about her grief first and her upbringing with her parents, because I feel like this defines her more than anything else. Very early on in the book, she refers to my dead parents' old house, which is a very offhand way to reveal that her parents are dead. Later in the book, she has to tell her forgetful shrink that her parents are dead. Multiple times. And each time she invents these ridiculous stories about how they died instead of telling the truth. Now obviously some people deal with grief by affecting a kind of nonchalance, or with dark humour, or whatever. These are coping mechanisms. But that's not really what this is, I don't think. She is grieving, yes, but not because she misses her parents. More because the presence of their tragic deaths in her life is a constant reminder of her childhood with them, how awful they were and how much they fucked her up for life. She articulates this here. And I didn't care about the housing market or how much money I could get. I wanted to hold on to the house the way you'd hold on to a love letter. It was proof that I had not always been completely alone in this world. But I think I was also holding on to the loss, to the emptiness of the house itself, as though to affirm that it was better to be alone than to be stuck with people who were supposed to love you but couldn't. And we get quite a few flashbacks over the course of the novel to show us the relationship, if you could call it that, between her and her parents. The dynamic was dysfunctional, to say the least. Here are a few details. My mother, due to some unspoken conflict with my father, let me sleep with her in their bed because, as she said, it was easier to wake me up in the mornings if she didn't have to get up and go across the hall. I accumulated 37 tardies and 24 absences that year. 37 times my mother and I woke up together, bleary and exhausted at 7 a.m, tried to get up, but fell back into bed and slept on, while cartoons flashed from the small television. My mother would smoke cigarettes, talk on the phone, hide from the housekeeper, take a bottle of wine with her into the master bathroom, and draw a bubble bath, and read Danielle Steele or Better Homes and Gardens. Talking about her father, he was a kind of non-entity, I thought. A stranger gently puppeting his way through his life at home, with two strange females he could never hope to understand. She'd been just 19 years old and already 4 months pregnant when they got married. I'd figured that out as soon as I could do the math. Stretch marks, loose skin, scars across her belly she said looked like a raccoon had disemboweled her, glaring at me as if I'd wrapped my umbilical cord around my neck on purpose. Maybe I did. My father was dispassionate, sulky, even a little snide at times. I took after him. My mother did say once we were both stone wolves, but she herself had a cold aura too. I don't think she realized it. None of us had much warmth in our hearts. So that last line pretty much sums it up. We can also see the origin of her urge to sleep as a defense mechanism of sorts, a refusal to deal with the realities of the world. We see that her mother did the same thing. And we get a few more scenes like this, showing us just how cold and mean and selfish her mother was, and how serious and impassive and joyless her father was. And we get glimpses into what kind of child the narrator was, and how a lot of those traits are still there. Her kind of languid passivity, for example. I could have acted out if I'd wanted to. I could have dyed my hair purple, flunked out of high school, starved myself, pierced my nose, slutted around, what have you. I saw other teenagers doing that, but I didn't really have the energy to go to so much trouble. I did crave attention, but I refused to humiliate myself by asking for it. I did all the right things. I rebelled in silent ways with my thoughts. My parents barely seemed to notice I existed. Here's a short conversation between her and her mother. Her mother says, "You know I don't like it when you cry." "I wasn't crying," I said. "And I hope you're not packing any shorts. Nobody wears shorts in Manhattan. And they'll shoot you in the street if you go around in those disgusting tennis shoes. You look ridiculous. Your father isn't paying this much for you to go look ridiculous in New York City." I wanted her to think that I was crying over my father's cancer, but that wasn't quite it. "Well, goddammit, if you insist on getting weepy," my mother said, turning to leave. "You know, when you were a baby I crushed Valium into your bottle. You had colic and cried for hours and hours, inconsolable and for no good reason. And change your shirt. I can see the sweat under your arms. I'm going to bed." And just after that we get this passage. "When I got lonely or bored or nostalgic, I'd go through the photos and try to disgust myself with the banality of the place," looking at her old house. A cracked step, a leak in the basement, a peeling ceiling, a broken cabinet. And I'd feel sorry for myself not because I missed my parents, but because there was nothing they could have given me if they'd lived. They weren't my friends. They didn't comfort me or give good advice. They weren't people I wanted to talk to. They barely even knew me. They were too busy to want to imagine my life in Manhattan. My father was busy dying. Within a year of his diagnosis, the cancer had spread to his pancreas, then his stomach, and my mother busy being herself, which in the end seemed worse than having cancer. So when the narrator's mother commits suicide, she leaves a note that says she found consciousness intolerable, much like her daughter. The suicide note bizarrely also has a list of people that she knew, on which her daughter was in 6th place, which is one of those great darkly funny lines in the novel. Heartbreaking, but also hilarious. So when you put all these scenes together, you get a very clear picture of the kind of upbringing she had and how that marked her. Growing up without any kind of love, compassion or support, or really even interest or basic human decency from her parents, has obviously led her to this point in her life, has fed into her inability to interact with the world in any meaningful way. There's an interesting metaphor late in the book which sums up how the narrator saw her mother. "I wondered if one day I'd be like her, a beautiful fish in a man-made pool, circling and circling, surviving the tedium only because my memory can contain only what is imprinted on the last few minutes of my life, constantly forgetting my thoughts." And this is how we find the narrator at the start of the novel, repeating the same pattern, treading water in life, basically. Withdrawn and secluded, unable to face being out in the world, unable to react to the world with anything but viciousness and scorn, which is pathetic but also very sad. So that's the story of her family and the effect they had on her, and her grief not just at burying them, but at having had to survive them. Let's talk a bit more now about her misanthropy and her antisocial nature. We already mentioned how callously she treats her only friend, Riva. I won't read out any more of her derisory comments, but there is one interesting moment late in the book, kind of a moment of self-awareness, where she realizes that maybe she hates Riva because Riva loves her. And we see that kind of self-loathing again and again. Early in the novel, we see other signs that she wholly rejects any kind of society or company. She talks about having to briefly leave the house to restock on pills and coffee and whatever else. That was always a painful passage. Everything made me cringe. I was like a baby being born. The air hurt, the light hurt. The details of the world seemed garish and hostile. I relied on alcohol only on the days of these excursions, a shot of vodka before I went out, and I walked past all the little bistros and cafes and shops I'd frequented when I was out there pretending to live a life. Otherwise, I tried to limit myself to a one-block radius around my apartment. Here's a short extract on the safety of the bodega that she frequents. It was close, and the coffee was consistently bad, and I didn't have to confront anyone ordering a brioche bun or no-foam latte. No children with runny noses or Swedish au pairs. No sterilized professionals, no people on dates. The bodega coffee was working class coffee. Coffee for doormen and delivery men and handymen and busboys and housekeepers. So in other words, she doesn't have to deal with anyone she sees as a real person. We're also told that she never talks to her neighbors. When she goes into the pharmacy, she's bitter and envious because these people are happy, they have lives. Here's a little ridiculous extract to show you what kind of community she does have with other people. I took the garbage out into the hallway and threw it down the trash chute. Having a trash chute was one of my favorite things about my building. It made me feel important, like I was participating in the world. My trash mixed with the trash of others. The things I touched things other people had touched. I was contributing. I was connecting. She mentions early on that she started hibernating and taking downers in order to drown out all of her thoughts. And her thoughts were mostly judgment and hatred for other people. So she has no interest in being part of the world, obviously, but where does this hatred come from? Is it a bitter envy at not being able to participate in society? An expression of her wish to be more normal, more regulated, more able to live a regular life? Possibly. Here's a nice vivid passage that sums up her attitude. I'd never been to the kind of party in the Polaroid photos, but I'd seen it from afar. Young and beautiful and fascinating people hailing cabs and flicking cigarettes, cocaine, mascara, the diamond grit of a night out in the town, random sex, a simple gesture in the bathroom stall, wading once onto the dance floor then back out again, screaming drink orders at the bar, everyone pushing toward the ecstasy of the dream of tomorrow where they'd have more fun, feel more beautiful, be surrounded by more interesting people. I'd always preferred a septic hotel bar, maybe because that's where Trevor liked to take me. He and I agreed that people looked stupid when they were having a good time. It's striking reading this that not only has she ever had a fun social life or a decent relationship or a worthwhile job, but given her parents and her upbringing, it seems like she's never even felt joy. And so she seeks out similarly deadened, cynical people like Trevor, who's a purely transactional dickhead, so that she can experience some kind of relationship, but also keep at arm's length any kind of emotional entanglement or sense of responsibility or compassion or anything really that will be part of a healthy relationship. Let's talk a bit more then about her attitude to sex, love, relationships. She says at one point that settling down sounds like death to her. She says, I'd rather be alone than anyone's live-in prostitute. It's interesting that she can only see that situation as transactional. We see Trevor treat her like shit throughout the book, both in flashbacks when they were together and in the brief moments that he reappears. Our narrator's contempt for herself is really evident here. There's a line where she says something like she had to respect Trevor for knowing how to manipulate her, even if she hated him for it. There's another example where she says she's determined to sleep away the vanity and shame of having degraded herself for someone like Trevor. At one point in the book, she calls Trevor and claims she's been sexually assaulted. She calls again multiple times, leaving messages. She claims she has HIV. She says she'll kill herself if he doesn't come over. Now, obviously this behavior is far from normal, and again, even though it's pathetic and horrible, it's also just very sad that this grown woman is acting like this to get the attention of a guy who couldn't give a shit about her. That's how fundamentally broken she is. She places no value on her own physical being or her emotional state, and she seems to seek out people like Trevor who will take advantage of her and leave her feeling even worse about herself. Another way we see the narrator's limited interaction with the world and the effect it has on her is through her job. She works at an art gallery. She's basically hired to be a beautiful person with a bad attitude, which is quite funny. She quits pretty early on, but before that we have a few scenes of her nominally working but barely functioning. She takes these frequent naps in the supply closet, and she goes on about how sad it was to be pulled out of those naps back into her real life. Again, we see that there's so much self-loathing here, so much contempt for her own existence. The day she quits, she wakes up from one of these naps and it's the middle of the night, the place is deserted. She just walks out of the place, never to come back, but not before taking a giant shit on the floor. Which again is one of those great little details from Moshfegh that's hilarious, but also tragic. She has nothing but disgust for herself, so she can't even summon enough dignity not to do something like that. So we see all of this evidence in the book for our narrator's mental and emotional and psychological struggles. And for me, the kind of thesis question being asked by the novel is, how do we, or can we, or should we, escape pain and suffering? We're told to do things like exercise, eat well, get plenty of sunlight, be with other people. But shutting yourself off, isolating yourself from the world, doping yourself up, going to sleep, watching the same comfort movies over and over again, never seeking out human companionship, all of this is radical. It's taboo. It's not what you're told to do. But not everyone can just start going to the gym or take up a new hobby. Some people are in too much of a depression to make those changes. Now, obviously, in an ideal world, those people would have a support network, therapy, medication, whatever they need, and hopefully that could get them through it. But the reality is a lot of people don't have that. So as awful as the main character is, and as much as we might see her actions and say, well, this isn't going to end well for you, we can also consider what might drive a person to a reaction as extreme as this. One really interesting element of the book are the blackout episodes she has, where she's technically awake, but she's so drugged up she can never remember anything afterwards. And it's only during these moments that she exhibits any kind of inclination towards self-care or caring for others. She books beauty appointments, she buys clothes, she goes out and buys an outfit for her friend's mother's funeral. These are the only times that she can express those parts of herself, which is tragic in itself. There's a good person in there somewhere, someone who craves a happy life, like all of us, but she can only see that possibility through a haze. She can only access it in these fleeting glimpses. The rest of the time she's shut off from it. It's something intangible and alien to her that only exists for other people. She can't even feel the basic emotions that most people feel. One of the few times she tears up in the novel is when she finds her drugs again at Riva's place. There's another hilarious scene where she's trying to think of sad things to make herself cry. I thought of beaches, steel magnolias, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., River Phoenix dying on the sidewalk in front of the Viper Room, Sophie's Choice, Ghost, E.T., Boys in the Hood, AIDS, Anne Frank, Bambi. I thought of The Colour Purple when Nettie gets kicked out and has to leave Celie in that house a slave to her abusive husband. That was sad. That should have done it. But I couldn't cry. None of that penetrated deep enough to press whatever button controlled my outpouring of sorrow. So let's talk about sleep for a minute. This is the whole crux of the book. She doesn't just want to be sequestered away in her apartment watching movies. She wants to not have to be conscious, which is quite extreme, obviously. Here she is talking about it. Oh, sleep. Nothing else could ever bring me such pleasure, such freedom, the power to feel and move and think and imagine, safe from the miseries of my waking consciousness. I was not an narcoleptic. I never fell asleep when I didn't want to. I was more of a somniac, a somnophile. I'd always loved sleeping. Early on, she says, not that what I was doing was suicide. In fact, it was the opposite of suicide. My hibernation was self-preservational. I thought that it was going to save my life. And we get a lot of this language repeated throughout the book. She wants to sleep all day and become a new person. She wants to be renewed, reborn. She talks about being on her way to a great transformation. She says, mine was the quest for a new spirit. She says if she keeps going, she'll disappear completely, then reappear in some new form. That was her hope. That was her dream. And there is a really sad hope at the bottom of this mental health breakdown. This torpor, this hole of the human condition that she finds herself in. A hope for change, a hope for a magical transformation that will enable her to be normal, to be healthy, to be happy. She slipped into this frame of mind of seeing sleep as this nourishing, regenerative act, as something positive, as a healthy process for change, as opposed to it just being a symptom of laziness or depression, something she's privileged enough to be able to indulge in, like her mother. Riva even tries to tell her this. She says, sleep is just avoiding your problems, but of course she doesn't listen. And we, reading this, can see that she's deluding herself. Here's a really instructive passage about a daydream she has. Part of me wished that when I put the key in the door, it would magically open into a different apartment, a different life. A place so bright with joy and excitement that I'd be temporarily blinded when I first saw it. A documentary film crew would capture it in my face as I glimpsed this whole new world before me, like in those home improvement shows Riva liked to watch. First I'd cringe with surprise, but then once my eyes adjusted to the light, they'd grow wide and glisten with awe. I opened the door to my apartment and, of course, nothing had changed. At the end, when she emerges from her sleep, she convinces herself that it worked. She goes to the museum, to the park, she sees people. She treats it like this spiritual experience of rejoining the world, of reintegration into society, fooling herself into thinking that she's undergone some great transformation, and that the truth of the world is suddenly revealed to her now. But of course she hasn't changed. She's still just a spectator of human joy, not a participant. There is no transformation, there is no rebirth, there is no catharsis. Let's move on and talk a little bit about wealth, class, and beauty. Wealth and class are everywhere in the world of the narrator. We already mentioned that she has the privilege of being able to try this renewal through sleep. She comes from a privileged background. Obviously, most of us would never have the freedom to indulge in such a thing. And we see her exult in her status a few times throughout the book. Here she is talking about Riva. Ironically, her desire to be classy had always been the déclassé thorn in her side. Studied grace is not grace, I once tried to explain. Charm is not a hairstyle. You either have it or you don't. The more you try to be fashionable, the tackier you'll look. Nothing hurt Riva more than effortless beauty like mine. When she goes to Riva's house for her mother's funeral, there's a lot of classist observations about how her family live. Just by looking at it from the outside, I could tell that it had wall-to-wall carpeting, humid, sticky air, low ceilings. I imagined cabinets full of crap, flies flurrying around a wooden bowl of brown bananas, an old refrigerator covered in magnets pinning down expired coupons for toilet paper and dish soap, a pantry packed with cheap store-brand foods. It looked like the opposite of my parents' house upstate. Their house was an eerily spare Tudor colonial, very austere, very brown. The furniture was all dark, heavy wood, which the housekeeper polished religiously with lemon-scented pledge. The lack of self-awareness and that snobbery is quite funny, considering where her upbringing has brought her. At one point, the narrator literally says, "I was born into privilege, I'm not going to squander that, I'm not a moron." So there's an interesting paradox at work here, of the narrator having been provided with all of her material needs by her parents, while being left completely bereft of any of the social, mental, or emotional necessities to lead a happy life. When she talks about Riva and her ordinary family, there's this kind of gloating derision at how simple they are, how poor they are, how unsophisticated they are. But there's such an emptiness to that criticism, because despite her own issues, Riva is much healthier and happier than the narrator. Wealth and status don't mean anything if you're miserable. And yes, money can buy happiness of a sort, because it can provide you with safety and security, with comfort, with better access to healthcare, with more leisure time. But ultimately, if you're as fucked up as our main character, it's all inconsequential. All that privilege is meaningless when you're this unhappy. A gilded cage of loneliness and despair is still a cage. It actually reminded me of a lot of the current billionaire class, Musk and Bezos and guys like this, because it's abundantly clear that there's no joy in anything any of these horrible pricks do. They're pathologically insecure, afraid and miserable, constantly worried about projecting an image of happiness and strength, but they're clearly deeply unhappy people, as well as being despicable human beings. The concept of beauty comes up a fair bit in the novel too, essentially just as another trapping of wealth or class, another element of status that people use to feel superior. Riva is obviously very insecure about her looks. She really typifies a certain type of young woman, feeling pressured by societal forces to deprive herself, to look skinny, to aim for male validation. There's a darkly funny line where Riva worries that she's going to look ugly crying at her mother's funeral because the married man that she's been seeing will be there. This insecurity is reflected in that of our narrator as well, but it becomes twisted and expressed through this kind of hollow vanity. She mentions numerous times how pretty she is. At one stage she looks in the mirror and she's comforted to see she's still tall, blonde and thin. She says everyone at school hated her because she was so pretty. She compares herself to beautiful actresses. Again, this is just an expression of her loathing for everyone else, for people who are happy, or who at least are trying to make themselves happy. Now granted, Riva's actions are not entirely healthy either. The narrator does mention her eating disorder, but instead of being, a supportive friend, or blaming a society that expects women to look a certain way, typified by men like Trevor, for example, she mocks her for it. There's a really pathetic moment where she breaks into Riva's apartment to get her drugs back, and she's disgusted by all these really banal things in Riva's home, like beauty magazine and sports gear for the gym and healthy food. And it really sums up how the narrator's own self-loathing has warped her to the extent that she just flings it back out into the world as jealousy. She's jealous that women like Riva are taking responsibility for their own happiness, instead of retreating into isolation or unconsciousness. So let's talk about the final point, consumerism, capitalism, and the US. The first thought I had when I realized that the book was set around 2000, 2001 is that because it would be basically impossible to write it set nowadays? Because you just can't lock yourself away from the world anymore. Given that we now all carry around devices that blare content at us every waking moment, that most of us are addicted to this intrusive consciousness-altering feed of slop that we consume so much of and that defines this moment in cultural and social history so profoundly. It was kind of sweetly nostalgic to see the tame, primitive ways that consumerism pervaded everything 25 years ago, because things have just got so much worse. But anyway, we see this passive, empty consumerism personified in the narrator, who is too self-involved to care about the world or politics or anything like that. So instead she soothes herself with the comfort content of her era. Here's a passage on her indifference. I didn't do much in my waking hours besides watch movies. I couldn't stand to watch regular television. Especially at the beginning, TV aroused too much in me, and I'd get compulsive about the remote, clicking around, scoffing at everything and agitating myself. I couldn't handle it. The only news I could read were the sensational headlines on the local daily papers at the bodega. I'd quickly glance at them as I paid for my coffees. Bush versus Gore for president. Somebody important died, a child was kidnapped, a senator stole money, a famous athlete cheated on his pregnant wife. Things were happening in New York City. They always are. But none of it affected me. There are a few other short scenes where we get news headlines either on TV or on newspapers, and she just has no interest in any of it. We also see the empty consumerism seeping in through the commercials that she watches when her VCR breaks. A commercial for cat food, a commercial for home saunas, a commercial for low-fat butter, fabric softener, potato chips in individually portioned packages, chocolate yogurt, go to Greece, the birthplace of civilization, drinks that give you energy, face cream that makes you younger. And her VCR breaking was a major catastrophe, because the number one way that the narrator passively consumes is through movies. Because it's so much easier to watch these safe comfort movies, especially the ones with her hero, Whoopi Goldberg, than it is to face reality. There's an incredibly long list of movies named throughout the book. Again, reminiscent of American Psycho with all the music references. Our narrator likes to watch safe movies, nothing too poignant or dramatic, nothing that will make her feel too much. She just wants to retreat into the security of 90s action movies or screwball comedies. At one point she watches Air Force One 12 times on mute, which is probably better than watching it 12 times unmuted. Harrison Ford and Whoopi Goldberg are really funny choices for her faves, because they both have so many movies that are kind of cartoonish versions of reality, and that always end well and safely for the good guys. Nothing too transgressive or dangerous, nothing that requires too much critical thought. I related to this probably more than any other element in the book. When I'm feeling like shit, all I want to do is put on something that I know really well. Something safe and soothing, something I've seen a million times, whether it's Star Trek The Next Generation or some mindless 80s action movie. So I definitely empathize with her here. Capitalism in the book is explored mostly through the modern art scene that our narrator briefly inhabits, or is witness to at least. Like I said earlier, there are funny sections talking about the different artists and all the different kinds of modern art that you get at the gallery, but there's one really excellent passage that nails this. The art world had turned out to be like the stock market, a reflection of political trends and the persuasions of capitalism, fueled by greed and gossip and cocaine. I might as well have worked on Wall Street. Speculation and opinions drove not only the market, but the products, sadly the values of which were hinged not to the ineffable quality of art as a sacred human ritual, a value impossible to measure anyway, but to what a bunch of rich assholes thought would elevate their portfolios and inspire jealousy and, delusional as they all were, respect. That really captures the excesses of capitalism and how it corrupts and co-opts something like art, shoving aside any human or cultural elements and transforming it into a carbon copy of every other transactional area of life under capitalism, hollowing it out and just using it as a means to siphon more wealth to the mega rich. We can see this happening with sports at the moment, for example, as sports betting takes us to the apotheosis of a process of commercialization of leisure that started decades ago. Let's finish by discussing what this book has to say about the US. Near the end of the book we have a few lines on the inauguration of George W. Bush as president. I went to the sofa, clicked the TV on. George Walker Bush was taking his oath of office. I watched him squint and give his monologue. Encouraging responsibility is not a search for scapegoats. It is a call to conscience. What the hell did that mean? That Americans should take the blame for all the ills of the world? Or just our own world? Who cared? And although this may be a little bit of a stretch, I do think Moshfegh is setting up an analogy here between the selfish, privileged, vicious and ignorant behaviour of her protagonist and that of the US. Not just in terms of the American society of consumption and consumerism, but also in terms of how the US acts politically, its material effect on the world. Because what is the final scene of the novel? What happens on the last page? The World Trade Center attacks, 9/11. On September 11th, I went out and bought a new TV VCR at Best Buy so I could record the news coverage of the planes crashing into the Twin Towers. Trevor was on a honeymoon in Barbados, I'd later learn, but Riva was lost. Riva was gone. I watched the videotape over and over to soothe myself that day, and I continue to watch it, usually on a lonely afternoon, or any other time I doubt that life is worth living, or when I need courage, or when I am bored. Each time I see the woman leap off the 78th floor of the North Tower, one high-heeled shoe slipping off and hovering up over her, the other stuck on her foot as though it were too small, her blouse untucked, hair flailing, limbs stiff as she plummets down, one arm raised like a dive into a summer lake. I am overcome by awe. Not because she looks like Riva, and I think it's her, almost exactly her. And not because Riva and I have been friends or because I'll never see her again, but because she is beautiful. There she is, a human being, diving into the unknown, and she is wide awake. So first of all, there's this darkly hilarious moment of our deluded main character, who thinks she's been spiritually reborn, finding a strange beauty in the sight of a woman, possibly Riva, throwing herself from the burning building and hurtling to her death. So it's a nice final moment to show us that she's still a hopelessly self-centered, ignorant gobshite. But that's not the only reason 9/11 makes it into the book. 9/11 happened because of the US, because of its conduct abroad, because of its decades of warmongering and murder in the Middle East. More specifically, in this case, because of arming bin Laden and others as part of its anti-communist warfare. But anyway, not to get into that. The point is that the parallels are there to be seen between the narrator and the US. She's a terrible person who assumes others think highly of her. She goes through life mindlessly consuming vapid entertainment. She never thinks about the effects of her actions on other people. She is completely self-absorbed. She ignores the lessons of her own experiences. She rejects truth. She's an unreliable narrator. I mean, I don't think it's that much of a stretch. And what happens to her? She goes through this transformative process, comes out the same, only worse really, because now she thinks she's better. And what happened to the US after 9/11? There was a lot of lofty rhetoric about togetherness and solidarity and all that shit. But it just made the US even more of a toxic, murderous influence on the world than before. It emboldened them to pursue more brazenly self-serving policies in the name of spreading democracy or taking revenge. The country became even more racist. The people became even more indulgent of its despicable behavior, all the while claiming that the aftermath of this tragedy had laid bare its soul or cleansed it or whatever other bollocks was spouted to justify its post-9/11 spree of war crimes that continues to this day. So far from being a bizarre or out-of-the-blue inclusion, I really loved the ending. I thought it was entirely fitting, and it really accentuated the stakes of the novel and the importance of the message. Because the attitude of the main character isn't just a result of her brain chemistry or her upbringing, it's intrinsically and causally linked to the society that she's a part of. And that is a scary thought. Alright, that's it for My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. I hope you enjoyed that. I'll be back again soon with another video. Hope to see you then. Take care of yourselves. Good luck.